January 22nd, 1991. It is 9 p.m. in Moscow, and a Soviet state television anchor reads an announcement that stops the country cold. Effective immediately, all 50 and 100 ruble notes are void. Citizens have exactly 72 hours to exchange a maximum of 1,000 rubles. Everything above that, gone. Permanently, without warning, without appeal. While that announcement was being read on live television, the people who already knew, the insiders, the connected, the members of the apparatus, had moved their assets weeks earlier. His name was Mikhail. He was a 51-year-old structural engineer in Novosibirsk with a Sberbank savings book containing 14,000 rubles, roughly 18 years of careful savings, built coin by coin through the steady Soviet life he had constructed with his wife Irina. He had done everything right. He had saved. He had trusted. By morning, 13,000 of those rubles were simply gone. Not stolen, not spent, reclassified into worthlessness by a decree he heard about on television. But here is what the history books don't tell you about that night. 3 floors above Mikhail, in the same concrete apartment block on Ulitsa Kirova, lived a factory foreman named Victor. Victor had no Sberbank savings book. He had something the state didn't know about, couldn't measure, and had no mechanism to touch. When the ruble crisis deepened into full hyperinflation, 2,300% by 1992, Victor did not lose his life savings, because Victor's life savings were not in rubles at all. This is not a story about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is just the example that happens to be documented in forensic detail. This pattern, the sudden decree, the overnight rewriting of the rules, the middle class destroyed while a specific group survived intact, plays out in Germany in 1923, in Argentina in 2001, in Lebanon in 2019, in Zimbabwe in 2008. It always destroys the same people, the ones who followed the rules, trusted the system, and saved in the form the system told them to save in. What protected Victor that night, and what protected a specific documented class of Soviet survivors across the entire collapse, were not the assets that appeared on any balance sheet, any Sberbank register, or any government ledger. They were 5 assets. And the Soviet state, for all its surveillance infrastructure, its internal passports, its residence permits, and its workplace monitoring, could not touch a single one of them. Here is the forensic record. Asset 1. Hard foreign currency held outside the banking system. Victor kept US dollars in a glass jar behind a false panel in his kitchen wall. He had been accumulating them for 6 years through a network of informal trades, a favor for a foreign trade contact here, a black market exchange there, building a position the state had no visibility into. Holding foreign currency was illegal in the Soviet Union. That illegality was precisely the point. When the Pavlov reform voided 50 and 100 ruble notes, Victor's dollars were not ruble notes. When price liberalization triggered 2,300% inflation in 1992, Victor's dollars did not inflate. They appreciated in ruble terms with every passing week. When the ruble collapsed from 1 USD equaling 6 rubles in 1990 to 1 USD equaling 6,000 rubles by 1998, Victor's jar became worth more every single morning he woke up. The mechanism is architectural, not political. A physical US dollar bill in a Moscow apartment in 1991 was not inside the Soviet financial system. It was not a claim on a bank. It was not a number on a screen controlled by an institution whose solvency was quietly collapsing. The Soviet government had no administrative mechanism to reach something it could not see, could not locate, and held no registry of. This is the pattern across every currency collapse in the documented record. In Weimar Germany, the foreign currency holder survived while the mark holder was destroyed. In Argentina, 2001, the depositor whose dollars sat in a Montevideo bank 90 minutes across the Rio de la Plata lost nothing, while the Buenos Aires depositor lost 75% overnight through forced conversion. In Lebanon 2019, the citizen with physical dollars outside the banking system retained purchasing power, while the citizen with a dollar-denominated bank account discovered their dollars had been administratively converted to Lebanese pounds at a rate the institution invented. The critical distinction is not which currency, it is where the asset sits. Hard currency inside a bank is inside the administrative graph. It can be frozen, converted, and subjected to capital controls by a single regulatory decree issued over a weekend. Hard currency held physically, in a form no registry records, exists in a different domain entirely. One is a claim on the system. The other is a fact independent of it. The Soviet ruble at its peak was considered the most stable unit in the command economy world. Soviet official statistics reported zero inflation for decades. The same system that insisted its currency was structurally immune to inflation gave citizens 72 hours notice to exchange their savings and called it a reform. The hard currency outside the system survived. The rubles inside it did not. Asset 2. Functional skills, not credentials. The Soviet Union in 1989 had, by any measure, the largest scientific and technical workforce on Earth. The Wilson Center documents it precisely. By every metric, The USSR operated the world's largest institutional scientific apparatus. Within 15 years of collapse, it was running at under 50% capacity. But here is what the aggregate statistic obscures. The collapse did not destroy all Soviet professionals equally. It destroyed two distinct categories with surgical precision: party administrators, Marxist-Leninist philosophy professors, ideological commissars, planning bureaucrats, every person whose expertise was an institutional credential built to serve the Soviet system, found overnight that the system their expertise was designed for had ceased to exist. The key was perfectly machined. The lock had been changed, but the surgeon still operated on the first morning of the Russian Federation exactly as she had operated on the last morning of the Soviet Union. The programmer who had written code for Soviet military systems was, by 1993, the most sought-after employee in Moscow's emerging private sector. The skill was portable across any system. The credential was jurisdiction-dependent, and the jurisdiction had dissolved. This distinction is more important than almost anything else in this analysis. A credential is a signal sent to an institutional market. It says, I completed this program within the system, and therefore qualify for this category of employment. That signal has value only while the institutional market it points at still functions. A functional skill, the actual capacity to perform surgery, write code, repair machinery, translate language, has value in any system, any market, any collapse, because it is denominated in human utility rather than in institutional recognition. European Patent Office research later documented a measurable increase in technology patent production in regions where Soviet scientific émigrés had settled. They arrived with no savings, no property, no institutional status. They arrived with a skill embedded in their nervous systems. No executive order had been designed that could reach that. Asset 3. Blatt. The economy of favors. Cambridge University researcher Alina Ledineva spent years documenting what she called Russia's economy of favors, the informal network of reciprocal exchange that had operated in the shadows of the Soviet system for 7 decades. Her published conclusion was precise. In transitional economies where institutional trust collapses, the emphasis shifts entirely onto interpersonal trust. The Blatt network didn't collapse with the USSR. It outlived it. Blatt was the Soviet informal economy of connections and mutual obligation. You secured better cuts of meat from the store where your schoolmate worked. You got your mother admitted to hospital faster because a colleague owed you a favor from 3 years earlier. You accessed Bolshoi tickets because someone you had helped remembered. For 70 years, the Soviet shortage economy had built an entire parallel economic system in the domain of human relationships, a system invisible to every state registry, every party ledger, every administrative database. When the formal economy collapsed in 1991, the formal institutions dissolved with it. But the Blatt network did not dissolve. It adapted its function from providing access to scarce goods to providing access to scarce opportunities in the new market economy. Hoover Institution research documented the outcome. After mass privatization, former nomenklatura appointees held approximately 2/3 of top positions in Russian business and government. They did not survive because they had savings. The savings were worthless. They survived because their networks were the deepest. The mechanism is structurally immune to every form of government seizure because it operates in a domain no government has ever successfully administered. You cannot freeze a relationship. You cannot impose capital controls on trust. You cannot bail in a reputation built across decades of reliable exchange. The Soviet state, which surveilled its citizens with more systematic intensity than almost any government in history, could not confiscate the fact that Victor's neighbor would feed his children because Victor had helped her family through the last shortage. Asset 4. The dacha. Food production outside the monetary system. Dr. Leo Sharaskin's research on post-Soviet food production contains a statistic that permanently changes how serious people think about economic collapse. Over 35 million Russian families, approximately 105 million people, 71% of the population, were engaged in dacha gardening by the mid-1990s. These plots, cultivated on just 3% of Russia's arable land, produced 92% of Russia's potatoes, 77% of its vegetables, 87% of its berries and fruit. As hyperinflation destroyed purchasing power and state food distribution collapsed. These plots were the empirical reason Russia did not experience a famine. The dacha was not a financial asset. It had no ruble denomination. When Pavlov's reform voided 50 and 100 ruble notes overnight, the dacha did not change value. When price liberalization triggered 2,300% inflation, the cost of growing a potato in your own soil did not increase by 2,300%. When the ruble collapsed from 6 to 6,000 per dollar, the August harvest was the same harvest it would have been regardless of what the central bank was doing. The asset existed entirely outside the monetary system. That was not an accident. That was the protection. The broader principle here is what every documented economic collapse reveals, but what modern financial analysis systematically ignores. productive physical capacity, the ability to generate food, heat, basic necessities, outside the monetary system does not require an institutional intermediary to deliver its value. It delivers value directly, denominated in potatoes. Potatoes maintain their value through 2,300% inflation because potatoes are not a claim on an institution. They are a fact. Asset 5. Physical goods outside the banking system. The Chelnoky lesson. By the mid-1990s, an estimated 10 million Russians had become Chelnoky, shuttle traders. These were former engineers, academics, factory workers who responded to monetary collapse by doing something deceptively simple. They converted whatever hard currency or tradable assets they possessed into physical goods, clothing, electronics, household items, bought abroad in Turkey, Poland, and China, carried back on trains and planes, and sold at Russian markets. At peak, these 10 million individuals were responsible for an estimated 10% of all Russian imports. They had understood, whether by instinct or explicit analysis, the single most important financial principle of a collapsing monetary system. A physical object reprices daily with reality. A ruble-denominated savings account reprices daily with the printing press. The person who held rubles through 2,300% inflation lost 96% of purchasing power. The person who converted rubles into a leather jacket before the inflation, then sold that jacket for rubles afterward, preserved their capital. Because the jacket's ruble price tracked the inflation while the savings account tracked the state's intentions, and the state's intentions were not aligned with the saver's interests. This is the same principle Stefan Zweig documented in Weimar Germany. City families carrying silverware and paintings to farmhouses to trade for potatoes, while farmers filled their homes with pianos and books. It is the same principle that appeared in Zimbabwe when citizens spent currency the moment they received it, converting it into any physical object before the next price change. When the unit of account fails, commerce reorganizes around whatever holds stable value. Physical goods outside the banking system reprice with reality. Financial claims inside the banking system reprice with the institution. And in a collapse, the institution is the problem. The pattern. Step back from all 5 assets and observe what they share. Hard foreign currency held physically outside any bank. Functional skills stored inside a human nervous system. Blatt relationships existing in the minds and habits of other people. Docker productivity generating food independent of monetary denomination. Physical goods that reprice with reality rather than with institutional decree. Every single one shares one structural property. They exist outside the administrative graph. Modern governments do not govern people directly. They govern through systems, banking systems, tax systems, property registries, employment records. These systems create a complete map of every citizen's financial existence. When a government enters fiscal crisis, when the math breaks, as the historical record shows it always eventually breaks, it harvests everything inside that graph first, and it cannot reach what is outside it. The Soviet citizens who lost everything in January 1991 were fully inside the graph. Their savings were in Sberbank. Their housing was state allocated. Their income came from state enterprises. Their pensions were state promises. Every single thread of their financial existence ran through institutional intermediaries the state controlled completely. When the state broke, every thread snapped simultaneously. The return. It is now 1995. The worst of the collapse has passed in the narrow sense that the institutions have stabilized into something that functions, even if barely. Mikhail, the structural engineer from Novosibirsk, is alive. He still has his apartment. He has rebuilt some savings. He's working, though not at his previous salary. But he has learned something he will spend the rest of his life trying to explain to his daughter, who was 12 when it happened and doesn't fully remember. Everything he was told to save in was inside the system. The ruble savings were inside the system. The Sberbank book was inside the system. The state pension was inside the system. When the system rewrote the rules over a single January weekend with 72 hours notice, every asset inside the system was subject to those new rules. He did not see it coming because the system that was about to betray him was the same system that had spent 50 years telling him it was trustworthy. Victor on the floor above him lost nothing that January. Not because he was smarter than Mikhail, because he had placed at least one asset outside the reach of the institution that was about to fail. That is the entire lesson. Not which specific asset, not what exact form. Just this: when the system that holds your wealth decides it needs your wealth more than you do, and history shows that insolvent systems always make exactly that decision eventually, what do you hold that it cannot reach? The Soviet Union announced until the day before the Pavlov reform that citizens' savings were completely safe. The system that tells you your assets are protected is the same system whose stability those assets depend on. It has no incentive to warn you. The documented historical record does. This channel reads that record so the pattern becomes visible before it becomes personal. If that kind of clarity matters to you, you already know what to do.